Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Catherine Matthews. I am the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. We are so happy to see you and thank you for attending tonight's talk. I also would like to thank our friends at Hubtown Tours for their support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, Massachusetts people had been largely driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, nor should their stories and their memories. Tonight, we kick off our fall speaker series season. We have 3 great talks coming up starting tonight. Looking ahead to October 29th, Sarah Nehama will offer a talk about the fascinating history of mourning jewelry. And then we have on November 14th, Cynthia Williams-Rezer, who will be discussing the revolution that happened in America's kitchens with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. My colleague Emily and I had the opportunity to hear Cynthia at a conference. I can promise you, you won't want to miss this talk. You can sign up for both of them on Eventbrite. Tonight, we welcome Mae Duane. When we think about the voices and efforts that have shaped this country, we probably don't always think about children. And yet, from the Salem Witch Trials through the fight against slavery, children have impacted the American story more than we might realize. Mae Duane is a professor of English and the director of the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute. She teaches and writes in the fields of American studies, African American literature, and the medical humanities. She is particularly interested in how definitions of youth and childhood shape culture and policies in ways that require the abdication of rights in order to claim care. She is the author or editor of 6 books, including Educated for Freedom, The Incredible Story of 2 Fugitive Schoolboys Who Grew Up to Change a Nation. She has discussed the roles of young people have played in history at Salon.com, Slate.com, and in the Children's Table podcast. So with that, one last reminder to mute your microphones, to put your questions in the chat because there will be time for Q&A at the end, and please to enjoy tonight's program. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mae.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that really generous introduction. And I want to start by saying, offering my thanks to Catherine, Emily, Nikki, and all the folks at Old North Illuminated. It's just an incredible honor to have the chance to share my work with you and your community, who are just such a beacon of really what we all hope to do in historical scholarship. So I'm just delighted to be here. All right, now I'm going to do that thing where I'm going to share my screen, which always takes a minute. And I'm going to jump right into what I've been thinking about. So when Catherine invited me to think about revolutionary children, I absolutely jumped at the chance. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. And so my talk is From Cradle to Revolution, Children and the Question of Freedom. And I think it is not a stretch to say that we wouldn't have had a revolution without America's children, broadly defined. And so that's my opening challenge, to think about how not only do we leave children out, but how much we actually owe them in the revolutionary age to have arrived at where we are today. So that's my challenge. At the end of the talk, you can tell me if you buy it. So I'm going to just jump right in. Oops. Okay. In one of his most quoted passages, the enslaved teenager, Frederick Douglass, because he is describing himself as a teenager at this point, Frederick Douglass looks to a future that will bring him freedom as he looks at ships traveling down the Chesapeake Bay. What sometimes gets overlooked when we read such gorgeous language, however, is that this scene unfolds during the life of a child. Douglas, at the time, the speech, the time that he's describing to us, would have been around 15 years old, the age of a high school sophomore today. And it's worth reading. Why am I a slave? I will run away. I will not stand it. Get caught or get clear, I'll try it. I have only one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing. Only think of it, 100 miles more north, 100 miles straight north, and I am free. Try it? Yes, God helping me, I will. It cannot be that I will live and die a slave. I will take to the water. Meanwhile, I will try to bear up under the yoke. I am not the only slave in the world. Why should I fret? I can bear as much as any of them. Besides, I am but a boy, and all boys are bound to someone. It may be that my misery and slavery will only increase my happiness when I get free. There is a better day coming. In some ways, this speech, this soliloquy, might strike a chord with any struggling adolescent today. We have that classic young person's restlessness, a sense of yearning for a bigger life, for something better than his current situation. Of course, in other ways, Frederick Douglass's situation is utterly alien to what we like to think about when we think about childhood and youth. Subjected to neglect, abuse, and life-threatening violence, Douglass's horrific childhood should be an anomaly in history books. But of course, it isn't. And here I'd like to draw your attention to a particular part of the passage, the part I have bolded. When Douglass comforts himself that he is but a boy and all boys are bound to someone, he wasn't wrong. In much of early America, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, but certainly for much of the 19th, to be a child, Black or white, native or immigrant, was to be, in some sense, bound, to be unfree. And a key story of revolutionary action in early America, I would like to suggest to you tonight, is a story in which children, in which young people convince older ones to change the rules, to move towards freedom. When we study children in the early republic, we are studying, among other things, how changing older relationships between parents and children, rulers and subjects, help to bring about new ways of thinking about power, about discipline, and about what we owe the little guy. Those shifts in turn, I suggest, help to shape how Americans came to understand how government should work, how the nation related to the world, and how to understand the future. So not to put too fine a point on it, one of the most important stories of the revolutionary spirit is, in many ways, a story about unruly children. Now, until pretty recently, children were rarely included in historical studies. And after all, if we consider history to be the great acts of great men, as it was considered for centuries, children simply do not fit. Even as our historical focus has broadened since then, children are often overlooked, and one might say for good reason. And if there's any historians in the audience or people who have tried to extract information about children will recognize this, right? Getting at the lives and experiences of children can be really difficult. They tend to leave little documentation, and the records they do provide are often filtered through adult eyes. But one of the surprises I've come across in studying children in early America is that once you start looking, you realize that some of the most important figures in our history were, in fact, children when they began to make history. Pocahontas, no matter what Disney might want us to think, was all of 10 years old when John Smith first laid eyes on her, and was a child when she served as a largely unwilling liaison between her tribe and the English. The Salem Witch Trials, Arthur Miller notwithstanding, began with and largely centered around 3 children aged 9 to 13. Abigail Williams, a seductive young woman played by Winona Ryder in the film The Crucible, was 11 years old in history when the trouble began. And just as a side note, John Proctor, the Daniel Day-Lewis character in that film, was actually 60 in the historical record. Benjamin Franklin, founding father, began his journey into independence before he was legally able to do so. He broke the law to gain his freedom at the age of 17. His great trip to Philadelphia took place both when he was 17 and when he was legally bound to his brother. So his nation-changing adventure was actually the act of a teenage runaway who, arguably should have been subject to the law and to being brought back home where he belonged. Lucky for us, he wasn't. Phyllis Wheatley, who's on the right there, an African-American poet, published her first work in 1767, when she was about 13 years old. In all of these cases, we find children pushing against the boundaries that constrained their lives and changed history in the process. And I want to just take a moment here and point out that it's really important when we're dealing with a topic as big as, childhood in early America, that there is no one single childhood experience, no one child we could hold up that would represent the experience of growing up in the early republic. Childhood hasn't been any more of a constant than womanhood or manhood or ethnic or sexual identity. While certainly there have always been children, what that meant for them and for the adults around them changes drastically, depending on where and when they are born, who their family is, what gender they happen to be, and what color their skin was. That said, there are some generalizations we can make. One is that in the New World, in the early days of settlement in the New World, children functioned as go-betweens. They function as cultural emissaries between world. Adults are finding it very difficult to navigate. So here, this is one of the earliest pieces of artifacts that come out of English settlement. This is an engraving by John White. And if you'll notice, the native little girl is holding an English doll in her hand. The children are almost always from the beginning, and Pocahontas was, of course, part of the story, go-betweens between worlds. They literally and figuratively crossed the borders. Adults often really wanted to keep distinct. If you were a child in North America from, say, and this is another point of generalization I would make, that if you were a child in North America from, say, 1607 through the Civil War, life was almost certainly harder than it is for today's children, and very often it was drastically shorter. As late as 1850, 20%, 1 out of every 5 children born in the United States, died before their 5th birthday. Another continuity, although greatly varying in degree, was the point I've already, actually, I haven't brought up, Frederick Douglass has already brought up. For most children in early America, their labor, their future, very often their bodies, are not under their control. And they often take drastic action to change that. So for today's talk, I'm going to just make a few short stops in the early republic for some close-ups on how these struggles unfolded and how children felt, how children make adults feel, and how that changed history. In a time of incredible cultural change, child rearing became a powerful testing ground for how power writ large should work. When children, and by extension their parents, changed one side of the formula, it inevitably changed the conversation on the other side. So I'm going to start with before the revolution, but I will get to the revolution, an example of early English settlers and how their ideas were changed about government, about power, about affection, about what we owe those who depend on us. How those ideas were changed despite the real resistance to it by witnessing the gentler child rearing practices of indigenous people. So in the 17th century, the alternate child rearing strategies, alternate to the English, that is, of Native people threatened and tempted European settlers by offering different views of children's functions in the world. For Puritan English settlers whose notions of religion, government, and society were built on a very particular, very hierarchical form of parent-child relations, these other children threatened the very foundation itself. So that's Cotton Mather on your screen. Yes, an amazing wig. And he's I'm sure many of you know, he's a Puritan divine. This is a moment in a sermon that is about children's duties to their parents. And you can see here, he's absolutely lining up that your parents are inextricable from political parents, from spiritual parents, from scholastical parents. Defiance against any one of them is going against a deep spiritual and political order. He gives us a sense of the, in a later sermon called The Family Well Ordered, Cotton Mather gives us a sense of the sort of correction Puritans felt was required to keep an orderly child household, and by extension, society. In this sermon, Cotton Mather insists that rebelling against the father figure was tantamount to throwing off the yoke of divine authority, right? Can you dream that God will allow any of these contempts against political parents, ecclesiastical or scholastical? In this formulation, I'll just go back here to this earlier part. The father, who would be responsible for the care and control of his own children, his wife, his servants, is all part of a chain, which includes other political parents, ministers, magistrates, school teachers. And this is what happens to you, right? So like God will not admit it. And this is what happens if you defy that order. An astonishing variety of retributions upon the body of a rebellious child. In this sermon, Mather uses a biblical story to evoke terrifying images of what awaits the disobedient sons and daughters. And this is extremely graphic. Like birds are picking out the eyes of young children. And I've got to say, like, when I was putting this talk together, I debated whether I wanted to include this because it is so graphic and so disturbing. But then I decided to leave it in because children were at this sermon. This was delivered to children, right? This is the duties of children to their parents. So to get a sense of both the resilience and the strength and the terror that are the children in American history dealt with, I felt like I should include this passage. This is what you were told would happen to you if you dared to rebel against authority. So just that's to set the stage. So now, New England colonists for a while, and will continue to be, coming up against what they felt was really the scandalously indulgent child rearing of indigenous people. I want to suggest that they were forced to reassess their own attitudes towards children. As several historians have documented, Northeastern tribes practice what we might deem today gentle parenting, often relying on praise rather than corporal punishment to encourage proper behavior. And just as one example, historian Karen Odell-Kupperman, who's done extensive work in this area, says that the Native Americans were universally described by English and Puritan settlers as affectionate parents. And that affection was a problem. English observers were disturbed and confused by the emotional investment Native parents had in their children. Now, for Puritans, right, a people schooled in resigning oneself without complaint to God's will when they came up against the profound grief of Native parents for lost children, they were deeply uncomfortable. This is one example from a writer, William Wood, who was struck by the terrible anguish Indigenous parents expressed at the loss of a loved one, noting their grief-wrung hands, tear-bedewed cheeks, and their doleful cries. Now, remember, as I've said, for Puritans, who I've already mentioned, like everyone else in this era, lost children to death quite often. To mourn excessively was to complain about God's will. So in their framework, right, engaging indigenous people's strong expressions of mourning and grief likely struck a chord, but one that they felt they needed to suppress. So in addition to the dangers of what Puritans would view as excessive mourning for lost children, they were also really worried about expressing too much love for live children. According to one Puritan pedagogue, I think I have it here. Too much love would lead to the loss of this child. When speaking of a favorite child, he warns that sometimes the Lord takes away such before the rest to punish the father's fondness. So actually to express too much love to your child is to invite God's wrath. This is a passage from John Robinson, who was read by the Puritans, who was associated with William Bradford, among others. And this, I think, it just distills it down. This is what a good parent did for their children or to their children. There is in all children, though not all alike, a stubbornness and a stoutness of mind arising from natural pride that must, in the first place, be broken and beaten down. And just to give you another example of this, Dodd and Cleaver, who were other Puritan child-rearing experts, acknowledged that parents they couldn't help but love their children, but told them to keep their affections a secret. And this is a quote from them: "Wisdom requireth that parents somewhat dissemble and hide their love, lest their children take boldness thereupon to do what they list." So just to summarize, in early New England, we have a clash between what Puritan adults wanted children to be. And what they wanted children to be was deeply enmeshed with how they imagined the world should work, certainly how government should work, how families should work. The story that Puritans told themselves about what childhood meant was being challenged by Native children and parents before their eyes. So that's take that stage now. Cotton Mather, in addition to writing really scary sermons, also edited and collected what was called at the time Indian captivity narratives. And scholars have made the point that these are the first instances of a truly American literature, something unique to what would eventually become the United States. These are stories in which European settlers chronicle their hardships and adventures when taken captive by Native Americans. And as you might imagine, writers like Cotton Mather were really, really invested in casting Indigenous people as villains. So this is just an example of some of the more famous ones. But I want to say, right, even these narratives give us an example of how, even in the space of absolutely resisting different ways of thinking about children, the actual lives of children shifted the narrative. And let me explain. I think these stories he told changed the way Puritans would be allowed to feel about rebellious children. The very sort of children that they had been watching, maybe even enviously, as they saw those Native children's feelings being supported and validated by their parents. And this is just one narrative. This is a quote, my narrative documented by Cotton Mather. And again, difficult language, but again, this is language that children of the era would have been subjected to in sermons. These were the books that were in children's houses. And, certainly in some cases, the experiences children were having. So what I want to point out here is, so he's describing this child who's crying because he misses his parents, which of course any of us would see as a completely natural thing. But, right, remember, for the Puritans, this is not allowed. You are not allowed to cry for your parents. You are not allowed to act against what the adult authority is telling you to do. Under the rules of obedience and submission that orders the Puritan household, and by extension, society, the child should remain resigned to his fate, right? But in this passage, the boy continues to cry, and they threaten him, but they are unable to extinguish the natural affections of the child. And then he goes on to relate that the captors are infuriated, right? And they, and they punish the boy in horrible ways. So what I want to draw your attention to, right, is in this scenario, Cotton Mather, the author, who's writing this for fellow Puritan settlers, is, of course, is directing our emotional energy as readers towards the child who's crying, towards the bad, rebellious child, and against the disciplinarian who, right, normally under the rules would be completely validated. The disciplinarian who punishes him. Here, the hand that holds the chastening rod not only invites but deserves the defiant rage of the child victim, and by our extension, the adults who are identifying with him. In other words, the suffering child in this story and many other stories like it allows Puritans to cross cultural boundaries and change the stories about disobedient children and righteously punitive parents. Rather than creating a narrative about the need to submit, which has always been what children were supposed to be doing, Mather's propaganda here, as problematic in many ways as it is, actually opens a space where readers can revel vicariously in the rebellion of an unjustly punished child. In his attempt to figure children as a site that shows that the Puritans are the good guys, Mather actually allows for a critique of Puritan authority made possible in no small part by the proximity and influence of indigenous child-rearing customs. So here, I'm going to suggest that the actual experience of Native children, the way they were raised, the open affection they experienced from their parents, worked to alter the way Puritans understood childhood itself, and in the process, the ideas of civil and national government based on the model of parent-child relations. So, and here I'm going out on a bit of a limb, but I want to say that it's not too far to say that we owe our natural investment as Americans in rebelliousness and our capacity for revolution in no small part to indigenous caretaking culture. Oops, I keep touching this wrong thing. Okay, there I go. So for me, it's this dynamic, right? This really charged atmosphere in which children are held up as victims and adults channel their fear and pain and helplessness by sympathizing over that victimhood that really provides the foundation for the intense and frankly unprecedented reaction to the young girls in Salem in 1692. These girls complain of all sorts of physical attacks, not unlike the sort of tortures that you see Mather's describing in the captivity narratives. Now, there certainly had been a long history of children as victims of witchcraft before Salem, and often it is a child who sets off many of these witchcraft scares. But I want to argue that the ways children were viewed in 1692 in Salem altered the equation about, again, whose sympathy is elicited, whose voices get heard. Although not all the afflicted in Salem were children, the affair began with young girls, and as the language of the trials insists, suffering children occupied center stage, both in the questions the judge asked and the drama that unfolded around the questioning. Betty Paris, age 9, began acting strangely in January of 1692. Soon, Abigail Williams, who was approximately 12, also became afflicted by February, and Putnam, age 12 or 13, and Betty Hubbard, by accounts around 17, also insisted that they were suffering the effects of witchcraft. Now, it wasn't, as I mentioned, it wasn't unusual that the troubles began with a suffering child. Many of the previous witchcraft investigations in New England and Europe began as a result of a child behaving strangely. But what was unusual was the credence, the credibility, the belief that met children's voices and the spectral evidence about which those voices testified. So before this, from the late 16th century on, betrayals of young people's behavior, sickness, having fits, which is often how that was described, had long been attached to witchcraft. Hartford Witch Trials, an event that anticipates Salem's hysteria and ferocity, began with the death of an 8-year-old girl who accused someone of choking her right before she died. And there was a year-long frenzy with 8 trials taking place in 8 months. But the important thing is, even though there was a child's accusation, accused witches were subjected to tests. And of course, right, from the 21st century perspective, these tests are ridiculous, but there were still, you needed some sort of outside proof. You couldn't just believe what a child said. So here's this image of the water test. Where they were bound hands and foot and dropped into a body of water. They rose to the surface. It was considered a proof of guilt. Another common test was the touch test, in which someone would be blindfolded and they would be touched by both like the accused witch and other people. And if they could tell the difference, that was supposedly evidence that what they were saying was true. But in these trials, and in most before Salem, children were not called upon to testify. And if they did say anything, there needed to be outside proof, such as the test I just described. But in Salem, things were different. Children were privileged testifiers, their words and acts alone, evidence of otherwise invisible acts. The degree to which children's voices were credited in Salem speaks to the emotional power that suffering childhood had accrued. Right? Right, and I'm not saying it's a mixed bag, of course, right? Because Salem was a case in which giving that attention to children and not doubting them at all also led to tragedy. But it was an incredible marking point in how children's experience and voices were accepted, and it illustrates how very high the stakes were on the question on how to interpret childhood distress. Historian Perry Miller has famously called the Salem Witch Trial the death knell of Puritan dominance, and thus the doorway to the revolutionary era that would follow. And in a way, he was right. The trials shook the Puritan establishment to its core, and in the process changed how people conceived the obligations children had to their physical and political parents. 8 years after the Salem Witch Trials, rebellious children are the unequivocal heroes of the nation. And this is just one of many, many political cartoons of the era in which America is portrayed as a rebellious child, and England is either an old man or an old woman who can't quite corral them. And of course, we're rooting for the children. American revolutionaries saw themselves as sons of liberty, righteously rebelling against a bad parent. Far from the original Puritan ideals in which obedience was the cardinal virtue, America is now railed against its adolescence being compromised by tyrannical parents. The Sons of Liberty rose up against the notion that they owed obedience to the mother country. The best-selling novels of the era told the unjust story of teenage girls being forced to marry against their will by tyrannical parents. And these seduction novels, our attention and affection and sympathies are directed towards the rebellious daughter. Thomas Paine casts England as a despotic mother who would devour her children. The child colonies, in other words, were being victimized by bad parents. But now in the revolutionary model, these naughty children had every right to rise up and throw off their suffering. They were right that they deserved the attention and respect of authorities. They were right to protest bad treatment. In short, they had rights. The talk of rebellious children was not and no longer metaphorical. And this is something I think is important to point out. The colonists that rose up and took arms against the British Empire were, in great part, children. They were around 16 years old. In 1790, the first year for which we have a census, the average age of white Americans, because that's who were primarily counted, is under 16. There were several members of the Continental Army that we know were around 10 years old. This is later on, but Andrew Jackson was admitted to a revolutionary militia at 14. Great numbers were around 16 in 1820. So a generation later, 58% of all Americans were under the age of 20. So it's a young nation, not just in metaphor, but on the ground in the battlefield. These were literally teenagers and barely young adults rising up against colonial parents. And I couldn't resist the Hamilton reference, but as any Hamilton fan knows, he was only 19, though his mind was older, in 1776. And what's more, they identify themselves as children, as young people who should be able, to rise up. That is, I don't know, well, they're quite yet, against tyrannous parents. So the rhetoric of the revolution and the idea of minors and dependents should be allowed to think and act for themselves, of course, did not extend to everyone. It did not extend to the ongoing scourge of slavery in the US. Enslaved people were often figured as docile children by pro-slavery arguments, who drew from older models of parent-child relationships to argue that enslaved people were obligated to obey their parents / their slaveholders, right? They're the people in authority for life. That argument, of course, defies the very soul of the revolution, that even children had a right to grow up, had a right to their own bodies, and had a right to govern themselves. And I want to say, as important as it is to point out the long and deeply problematic history of metaphorically rendering enslaved African Americans as children, which often happens through infantilization and paternalizing monologues. I mean, slavery was literally referred to as the patriarchal or the paternal institution. I still want to point out, right, again, to carve it out of metaphor, an important and sometimes less noted point. Millions of American children grew up in slavery. Many of them endured the arduous Middle Passage. Work by historians David Eltis and others reveals some astonishing statistics. Up to 20% of all people on slave ships, and this is to North America, but also to Brazil and elsewhere, 20%, 1 out of 5 of these people were children. Estimates are that 12 million people crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade. That breaks down to little under 2.5 million children torn away from their homes and families and starting new lives as enslaved people. In 1860, as late as 1860, records indicate that more than half of the enslaved population in the United States were under the age of 20. I want to argue that these children offer yet another example of how young people's courage, resolution, and determination to change things helped push American history toward freedom. as slavery created millions of orphaned and suffering children within the US, and as Black writers would eventually write of their childhood pain in the first person, their experience would eventually shape public opinion on questions of freedom and self-determination. Diaries, slave narratives, and other historical sources indicate that as white witnesses describe the horrors visited upon children, and as formerly enslaved children or currently enslaved children describe their own experience, they further altered what childhood could and should mean. And I'd like to just look at one example of how narrating slave childhood demands a different register, a different set of meanings than what was available to European experience, by looking at briefly Phyllis Wheatley's work, who I've already mentioned, began writing her poetry as a child. So just this is an example of the sort of poem that fits very much in the model of earlier models, Christian models, Puritan models of how you're supposed to deal with the loss of a child, right? And you'll notice in the poem, there's a focus on the parent, encouraging them to be happy because after all, your beloved child's in heaven. It's a better place. God is in charge. It's okay. I will say Phyllis Wheatley, who was one of those 2.5 million children enslaved and brought to the US as a child. She was brought to the US at the age of 8. She had her first poem published around the age of 13. Writes several of poems in this vein, right? Telling the parents, God loves, your child is in a better place. But then, speaking of her own childhood, the register really changes. The slave trade, being an enslaved child, her life demands a different framework to convey this loss, to convey what has happened. The separation that she describes that occurs through the slave trader is not the act of God. It is not providential. And it's quite clear that the child is going to suffer greatly in its new environment. Wheatley thus offers a strikingly different image and demands a strikingly different set of emotions than the smiling babe in heavenly bliss that was the standard model for children separated from their parents. And for Phyllis Wheatley, Oda Equiano, Venture Smith, and many others, this scene where a child loses his or her parents is the primal scene of slavery. It is a scene that demands a new attention to the pain of childhood loss. It's a strikingly different formulation to suffering and dying in childhood that had been circulated to this point. And I think it's really important she's still very young when this comes out, and she's telling her own childhood story. And it's her own childhood pain that she's insisting that we respect. Now, notably, on the other side of the argument, pro-slavery writers also focused on childhood suffering, and they cast themselves, the enslavers, as the saviors of suffering children. They insisted, in a painfully ironic twist, they insisted that they were the ones who were protecting infantilized African Americans. But in many ways, with the Revolutionary era problem of unjust authority, when applied to slavery, on both sides of the argument, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, was framed in terms of bad parents and suffering children. The child becomes a place for adults to fight over who is a good ruler and what a child deserves. But I think if we pay close attention to the experiences and words of children themselves, we come up against much more than the story of helpless victims who need white knights to come and rescue them. Two of the most famous slave narratives we read in classrooms today, the narrative of Frederick Douglass and the incidents in the life of a slave girl, that's Harriet Jacobs on the right, that's Frederick Douglass on the left, feature a hero and heroine who defy cruel masters and escape their clutches as teenagers, Frederick Douglass has his famous fight with slave breaker Covey at 16. Harriet Jacobs defies her master from the age of 15 on. Right? These are the story of rebellious teenagers. And once again, we are encouraged, rightfully, to identify with their rebellion, to find the justice in a young person refusing the rules that were created by their elders in favor of their own freedom. So our final stop this evening, we'll look at some child-created writing and consider how we might read them through the artifacts of what I think is a revolutionary institution, the New York African Free School. This was a school, or rather a cluster of schools, there were between 4 and 5 at any given time, that existed in New York City from 1787, so right after the Revolution, to 1833. And it was created as an act of revolution itself, right? And in the wave of revolutionary optimism, Alexander Hamilton himself was on the committee that first created these schools. And the founders felt that the children of enslaved parents needed to receive an education so that they would be ready for freedom when that day came. This school, and others like it, represented an investment in the revolution's belief that education, an environment, and a child's own merit, rather than bloodline, is what led to good citizenship. From the beginning, students at school were heralded as examples for the revolutionary cause of emancipation. This school held what they called examination days once a year, and these are not so different from perhaps like school plays or performances you might attend today. They were attended by parents and neighbors. They were also, and this is what's different, attended by politicians, important men around town, and major newspapers. The schoolwork of these children, the very stuff that today, right, we might stick on our refrigerator and then eventually, it falls off, or maybe it winds up in a personal scrapbook. These were purposely preserved as vital documents, and this is why we're lucky enough to be able to access them today. These sketches, and I'll just go through a few of them. So everything you're seeing is the work of a student. So this sketch and this beautiful handwriting is from a child. I think this one is aged at 13 years. This was held up for everyone to admire. This is a portrait of a descendant of Napoleon, right? And these, again, childhood artifacts, very good, right? Excellent work, but not the stuff of history we would normally think. But it was. The children who created this art, who created this work, as young as 9, as old as 14, were on a public stage, were on a national stage. National newspapers would report on how good or insufficient their work was, because it was a national test of their ability to qualify for freedom, to qualify for citizenship, to qualify for rights. Right, their work was as a deeply important part of the debate that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The stakes, as I've already suggested, were high at the school, and I feel quite sure that the students surely knew it. Not only did their student performances, because they would also put on skits and give speeches, in addition to showing off their schoolwork, articulate questions that both white and Black adults were debating about freedom. They themselves offered new ways of thinking about freedom might look like. Because these students' abilities were on display for all of New York City and by extension, the nation, and because prejudiced, pro-slavery, and racist detractors would say, like, well, this can't be original. This can't be the work of actual Black children. Originality became really important. This emphasis, again, in many ways was a new way of imagining what children could do. In order to determine what one could say about New York African free school children, the children themselves were allowed, or rather expected, to plumb their inner lives, to create original work, to create an individual expression, and share it with the public. And this is an age in which your standard educational process was to copy, right? It wasn't considered plagiarism at all to copy. Right? George Washington talked about copying the sentences in the handwriting of great men. But because of the pressures on these particular children in this particular school, all of a sudden there's a pressure on this being original, being something a child themselves thought of and worked on without help. And this is just one moment. And I don't know if I have the slide of this. No, I don't. But I will tell you the story. So the records tell of one student, George Allen, the 12-year-old student there, and he's described by the schoolmaster as a boy of, quote, pure African descent. And he's given a room of his own, right, heads up to Virginia Woolf, to create an individual expression on any subject he pleased. He gets his own space in a crowded schoolhouse. He gets his own pen, and whatever he produces is shared with the public. This is exactly the sort of private retreat that the Romantics would later insist was the domain of a true artist. And I want to suggest that a prejudice against their abilities, these students' abilities, wound up having the unintended effect of privileging the original thoughts and work of these children. These students certainly made the most of that unintentional lesson. They leaned into trusting their own thoughts and beliefs instead of the ones imposed on them by the schoolmasters who were training them to be obedient and grateful. In the 1820s, one teenage student, Henry Highland Garnett, began organizing his schoolmates. He was probably about 13 or 14, for political action, making plans for a future in which they would lead those left behind in slavery into a new era. This group, ranging from 13 to 16-year-olds, all resolved on a different take on their revolution. They all resolved that they would refuse to celebrate the 4th of July as long as slavery existed. They knew that the revolution had left them out. This new generation of revolutionaries were well aware of their exclusion, and they saw their schoolwork as a means to achieve freedom, though not quite in the way the school administrators would imagine. They pledged that, quote, when we had educated them ourselves, we would go south and free our brethren in bondage. We know about this because the young student who created this group went on to become famous. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him in one second, Henry Highland Garnett. But I want to say that historians have called the Civil War the Second American Revolution. And these school children made good on their plans to overturn the systems that oppressed them in that Second Revolution. The alumni, the members of these teenage clubs that met between these lessons, read like a who's who of abolitionist heroes. James McCune Smith, who's on the left there, was the first African-American MD. He wrote scathing critiques of white experts' studies in scientific racism, and he worked with Frederick Douglass on his second autobiography. Henry Highland Garnett, the leader of the Teenage Revolutionary Club, took the training in public speaking he learned on examination days in directions his schoolmasters could have never imagined. His address to the slaves is a rhetorical masterpiece and led to his invitation to speak in the House of Representatives in support of the 13th Amendment in 1865, the first Black person to have had that honor. Oops. Here. We also have other alumni, Ira Aldridge, the first American of any complexion to be a Shakespearean actor in London. Alexander Crummell, who is a legendary educator, missionary, and activist. Each one of these people deserve books about them. And I'll end by saying, the more I study children in American history, the more I feel compelled to recognize the profound debt we as a nation owe to our children. Their refusal to blindly obey, their courage to question authority, and their audacity to imagine a different future have repeatedly charted different but all-powerful revolutionary paths for our nation. These young voices, be they colonial era children acting as cultural emissaries, the Sons of Liberty demanding independence, or enslaved children fighting for their freedom, they have all consistently challenged us to re-examine our notions of authority, freedom, and human rights. They have pushed us to live up to the ideals we profess, often embodying the very spirit of revolution that we celebrate as quintessentially American. In our own moment, I think we would do well to remember that the seeds of change often lie in the unruly questions and bold dreams of our youngest citizens, their refusal to accept the world as it is, and their insistence on imagining how it could be.